Welcome to Buildings and Beyond,
the podcast that explores how we can create a more sustainable built environment
by focusing on efficiency, accessibility, and health.
I'm Rob Aldrich.
And I'm Kelly Westby. Andrew Peel is the founder and managing principal of Peel Passive House Consulting and one of only a handful of Canadian-based Passive House certifiers accredited by the German Passive House Institute. Prior to forging out on his own, Andrew worked in a variety of projects across Europe, including managing the UK government's Carbon Saving Technologies database and Energy Saving Trust's Best Practice Helpline. He also managed and delivered Passive House, Code for Sustainable Homes, wind turbine development, and thermal modeling projects, and organized Passive House tours. He also contributed to the energy saving calculation methodology for the UK regulators and the Passive House Institute. So, without further ado, I'm going to jump right into this episode. So, thank you for coming on the podcast today, Andrew. It's excellent to meet you.
Well, and thank you, Kelly, for this opportunity. I love speaking about Passive House at any opportunity.
Awesome. And so how did you become interested in Passive House specifically?
Mine might be a non-traditional route to Passive House. So I was actually studying renewable energy in Germany, doing a master's there, and I just realized in the course of my studies that it was actually easier to save a kilowatt hour of energy than try to find different ways of producing it. And so that veered me into energy efficiency and ultimately energy efficiency in buildings. And being in Germany, I happened upon the Passive House Institute and was fortunate to get a position there. And so I worked there for some time. And that's really where I laid the foundations of my Passive House knowledge.
So what we have you on to talk about specifically is a project that you've been talking about quite a bit, Scott's Subaru dealership in Canada. And can you tell us a little bit about why it's so important to talk about this project?
I think for one, it's a beacon project. It's the first of in the world, right? We're very proud to be part of this, and really have to acknowledge the owner for making that commitment. Garrett Scott from the Scott group of car dealerships. It's a family-run business for 50 years. To really showcase, hey, this is possible. I mean, Passive House and car dealerships generally, before this project, they were not spoken in the same sentence, right? Being able to demonstrate to North America, to the world, like, hey, this is possible, right? And I think that's one thing that Passive House has been great at, is showing people what's possible, and then others can follow in their footsteps.
Yeah, absolutely. And diving in on that project a bit more, what was the biggest challenge that your team faced through design and construction?
Certainly numerous challenges. That was probably the most challenging project we've worked on in Passive House. Wow. I think the ventilation was the most challenging. You're dealing with car exhaust. I know there have been projects, including some that we've worked on with commercial kitchens. You're dealing with kitchen exhaust, and that's a challenge. This is kind of next level because it's very difficult to do heat recovery on this, and the rates can be quite high. I mean, for a small repair shop, it was about 2,400 CFM, which was many times the actual background ventilation rate that would be required in such a space. And so we exhausted our the options for heat recovery. In the end, none of the manufacturers would actually warranty their equipment for use in heat recovery with car exhaust. Right, kitchen exhaust, you can do that. It tends to be expensive, but there are solutions. With car exhaust. We couldn't find a viable solution, so we had to come up with other creative ways of really limiting the losses from that system.
Okay, excellent. So you did end up just exhausting that directly and then providing makeup air, but finding other solutions to limit the overall energy consumption of the project.
Exactly.
Wow. And what was the biggest mistake that was made during design and construction process?
It's actually not an uncommon one in Passive House, where the detailing isn't worked up early enough. I mean, just due to the nature of how ultimately the client chose to contract the project. a lot of the detail wasn't designed up front, and so went into construction not having all the, particularly the envelope solutions decided. Okay. And so then it ended up falling on the contractor who didn't have Passive House experience, but they actually, one of the key guys had a design build experience, so he kind of straddled both worlds. So we were able to work effectively with him to come up with solutions. But unfortunately, they were in situ, and so we didn't end up coming up with the most cost-effective solutions. So looking back, doing it again, there's certainly improvements, particularly from the cost side, that we could make if we were to do this again.
Interesting. Yeah. And I see that issue obviously a lot in sort of standard or at least non-passive house construction, that the design is ongoing as the construction is ongoing. And sometimes, lagging only a week or so behind in terms of coordination, at least. So it's interesting to see that challenge comes up even on projects where the owner was very committed, it sounds like, from the beginning to passive house. Even then, you still have issues getting everything kind of pen to paper before construction starts. Yeah,
exactly. One of the things is, these business owners, they're not developers, they're not of the construction world. So they don't have an intimate knowledge of the process, right? And so, they're trying to do it, they're, relying on others, the architect and whatever, but they're still, they have a different mentality, right? So when they look at like design fees, they're not used to dealing with that. So they're like, well, okay, we've got to limit that. Like, why am I spending a lot of money on design fees, right? It's the building I want to build. So, that kind of dynamic exists. So, somewhat understandably, they're not used to the process, right? But again, if you were doing it again, he understands the process now. So I think things will be different the next time.
Yeah, excellent. That's a great point. What was the most important thing, whether it's a person or a process or a technology, that was critical in driving the success of the project?
Keeping the client committed, right? They had enthusiasm for the project, and when you get into budgetary issues or timelines or whatever, he's running a business, so keeping him focused on not just I need a building for my operations, like keep the long term in mind, don't make short term decisions now. And so a couple of us on the team were instrumental in kind of keeping him on board. Again, he was committed ultimately. It's easy to lose sight of the bigger picture at times. So I think just ongoing reassurance, reinforcement of like what the goals are ultimately was crucial to keeping things on track.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point. I think in life probably is to have a stated vision up front. And I think that's part of the sort of integrated design process, is have that stated goal up front and then make sure that everybody's holding each other accountable to those goals. Mm-hmm. So, making that commitment. And then obviously on day two, when something's on fire or something gets delayed or whatever, literally or figuratively on fire, I guess, then you can kind of refer back to those stated goals. Mm-hmm. That's excellent. And so now that you have a little bit of data, and you mentioned the data, and I think you had posted a blog post on this too, so we can link to that in the show notes. But can you describe a little bit, how is the building actually performing compared to its peers, compared to the energy model? Yeah,
this is in a way a bit of a unique situation in Passive House because what we have is comparable buildings, right? So normally, developers building, say, an apartment building, and they're like, oh, you could build it to code, you could build it to Passive House, but those, you don't build it to both. Like, you're not building two buildings side by side and then can compare how does it actually compare versus, in some cases, theoretical modeling. Right. So we had, we designed and built this, the Subaru dealership, but he had in the family business, they had two other directly comparable buildings that existed and been operating for a while. One was twice the size and one was half the size, but both had repair shops, similar uses, right? Mm-hmm. And then we were able to collect data in a similar timeline for the three different projects. This is just overall utility bills. He hasn't installed a monitoring system. So we don't have detailed information, but just looking at the utility bills, which includes everything, water, gas and electricity, sewage, all that. We see, compared to the other buildings, between 64% reduction in utility bills, right? And we didn't do anything on this project to really limit the water use and sewage. So I'd assume that those would have comparable expenses. So actually, potentially energy savings are a bit higher than that on the project, because if you take out the portion of non-energy costs and utility bills.
That's excellent. And you didn't end up having the breakdown between energy costs and water costs, unfortunately.
No, he hasn't provided. I mean, it's sometimes difficult to get
all the information
because he's a very busy business person, so it's not necessarily always his priority, right? So we managed to get some utility data, and I think they're going to be sharing further in the future. So yeah, I think hopefully excellent. We'll get, and maybe they'll eventually install a monitoring system as well.
Yeah, great. And I was actually just having a discussion this morning about that gap between sort of the performance monitoring after the fact. How do you even get that data once the building is built? Obviously, it was built for a specific purpose that the people engaged with the building are now focused on. So that's an excellent point. But it's great that you were able to get some data and you were able to compare, and 60% savings, 60 to 65 or more. That's pretty incredible.
No, definitely.
And I want to circle back to your comment on the modeling versus reality. I think it's a sensitive subject maybe in the industry a little bit, and it's one that's near and dear to my heart because I live a lot in the kind of commissioning world, and the difference between what we write down on paper or what we put into the software and what actually exists in real life. And so I am curious. You mentioned that difference between if you have an energy model that's built to compare to a made up building or a baseline building that, it's not necessarily created to decide, what the actual energy consumption will be at the end of the day. Passive house model, can you describe to us a little bit what that looked like for this building and whether the energy model, did it reflect the post-consumption information that you were getting, or you weren't really able to compare because you didn't get that granular energy data?
Yeah, so even with just a whole energy, what's the overall energy use of the building, we haven't gotten that data. So I think eventually we'll be able to report back. So unfortunately, we can't make that direct comparison. And we didn't build a code reference, or we didn't even model one of their other existing buildings to get kind of calibration, because at the end of the day we did have to make estimates about repair shop energy. As an example, I don't think there's any data on how much does an air compressor get used in a car dealership in a year, right, or a car hoist or whatever, right? So we make reasonable estimates based on owner feedback of how they use their other buildings, right? But even if we could just separate that out and get the other, heating, cooling, hot water use, lighting, all that separated from the repair shop, we could start to make that comparison. Again, we don't have data at that point. So how it compares to the model is difficult to say, but I'd certainly say that I'd expect the heating and cooling loads and the annual energy demand for heating and cooling to be very close to the model, because we've seen that consistently with passive house buildings. Generally, they have good monitoring on that side. That's in different climates, different countries, shown that there's a good match, right? Let's call it not auxiliary electricity, but other uses. Again, car repair shop,
process loads, or other uses.
I could expect there would be a deviation there because it was a bit of best engineering guesses.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that takes us back. Maybe we've done a lot of work on larger buildings, even, multifamily. It's still residential, but the loads are going to look a lot different than a single family home. So when you kind of build up, obviously there's lots of examples of single family homes and the data and the energy that they use. And there's lots of points of comparison. And then when you get to some of these specialty use types, you don't have that point of comparison anymore. So that's really what's interesting. Yeah, well, we'd be excited to hear any further data that you were able to share. We also looked at that sort of comparison of energy model to reality in some of the buildings, newer, larger passive house buildings in New York, to figure out where the gaps are. And is there, on that process load side, perhaps, is there training that needs to be done for the energy modelers, for example, or other opportunities to kind of make a more robust model so that we can have better prediction of how the building will actually consume energy and meet those loads.
Yeah, definitely.
Has anything needed any tweaking, any updates on the mechanical side or the system side?
Not that we've heard of. So if there's been communication, for instance, with the mechanical engineers, we haven't been directly involved. I don't think so. I know after it had been occupied, I think there were some, I'll call it recommissioning, but the ventilation system hadn't been quite set up from a controls perspective. We actually had an intermittent part of the way of reducing ventilation loads was an intermittent operation. And that hadn't been set up properly. So, the ventilation system was running all the time so that when we saw the initial commissioning report, like, okay, well, now this needs to be adjusted. So, but that was part of, it went through the Passive House certification process. So that kind of third party check was there to make sure, okay, how it was designed from a Passive House perspective, operationally, is that actually being implemented? And so that was caught and then rectified.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I think maybe I read something else that you wrote about a project that was, maybe designed to Passive House versus actual certification. So maybe talk a little bit more about what the differences you see there are and the importance of kind of that verification layer.
Yeah, I think so. Both through design as well as construction and commissioning, is what, particularly what's being modeled, reflective of the evolving design. And we already talked in this project about how some of the details weren't really worked out. Well, if they aren't worked out, and then during construction even, it's not ideal to do this, but if you're not coming up with the solutions and then reflecting that back into the energy model, well, you've already got a disconnect that's growing or carrying forward through the construction, right? And then commissioning, you have an independent commissioning agent. They're doing their thing, and you trust them or whatever. But if things haven't been communicated properly about how it needs to be commissioned, or like what's standard commissioning versus kind of, let's say, enhanced or like full with a particularly energy efficiency in mind versus just simple operation of make sure there's air getting into the building or heat circulating around, right? To me, that third party check assurance for the building owners is critical. It's like, yes, does this align what's been done versus what was expected, and that what was expected was like clearly laid out.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, because we also see that all the time. You mentioned the envelope details not being worked out 100%. And also on the ventilation system, the sequence of operations probably wasn't 100% figured out. So the commissioning provider can only test to what's been designed or what their best guess is once the design is over. So that's an excellent point. And what are one of the lessons that you would take away into your next project?
It's a challenge because this continues to come up, unfortunately, where there's just not enough scope or how the project goes. Like, we don't figure things out fully during the design. It's a lesson that keeps coming up in Passive House in general, right? So, it's like, have fun, I guess, we haven't cracked the nut on, being able to consistently have this in all projects, because our client, I think similar to SWA, that of your client type probably varies, and it's new approaches, so you figure things out maybe in one space, but then trying to transfer that to another client type or whatever, it can be challenging. So I guess as a lesson, we haven't figured out how to deal with that fully, right? It's continuing to navigate it, but that continues to be a critical piece. It worked out in this project, but like I said, there are definitely more cost-effective solutions we could have implemented.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And it's hard to, in cases where you do determine it upfront and it saves money, it's hard to say what the money that you didn't spend, right? It's hard to sort of describe what that would be. And so
we actually have a project now we're trying to do that, where we're trying to do parallel kind of conventional and optimized, as best we can, and then even working with contractors that are already on board to price out different options so we can really see this is actually the financial impact of these decisions. So we're hoping we're still navigating it. We're hoping we can get to that so we can kind of report to say, hey, here's some real value you're driving from these fundamental changes in design, right?
That's excellent. Yeah, I know we've run into a lot of problems. People ask, what's the added cost of Passive House? And how do you really tease out all the different things that are just required for Passive House? It can be really difficult to have that kind of breakdown in terms of the costs throughout the project for each individual thing, because at the end of the day, you're just paying for a full project. And so, and sometimes things get lost in the noise in terms of the roll up. Is that what you were finding too? Is that why you're looking into it with this study? Or project.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, we're trying to more and more turn the approach into what's your budget? How do we make Passive House work within it? Right. So many factors of influencing the price, the cost of construction, right? And so it's easy to, if something new like Passive House, to point your finger if it comes out over budget. So we're a big proponent of setting the budget and working within that, and doing enough detailed design throughout the design and getting it costed throughout, meaningfully costed with somebody who understands Passive House and can cost it appropriately, so that you get a good steer from the beginning. This is what it's going to cost, so you don't have a surprise at tender, like, oh, we're X% over budget, now we need a value engineer. Passive House is often one of those things that gets value engineered out.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you mentioned recommending costing early by someone who knows Passive House. Is that necessarily the firm that will ultimately do the construction, and you're having success in that way? Or are you having a third-party cost estimator that has more experience with Passive House brought on kind of early?
I'm a big proponent of having the contractors on board, particularly the GC. If possible, envelope and M&E contractors as well. Even if that's in a design assist capacity where maybe they still have to bid on the full project because of procurement rules, like if it's a public body, they can't just hire the GC up front as well if it's not like a design build or something, right? So we have to navigate that. That's where it's interesting with the private clients, like business owners, where there's more flexibility. They get to choose, how do I want to procure this? The key is there then just getting there early enough in the process to be able to influence how they procure. But yeah, if we can get contractor feedback, ideally we find they have a great finger on the pulse in terms of material prices and other ways of doing things that may be more cost effective, right?
Right.
So yeah, we find that the most beneficial approach.
And for this dealership, do you know anything about how much this project costs versus those other two that you alluded to?
No, the owner has not revealed that to us, unfortunately. Okay. I'm not sure. I mean, I was surprised at the savings in utilities, actually. Okay. So we don't have a bearing, but I mean, I think, from a life cycle cost perspective, I think it's actually come out more favorable than I had maybe expected, given I know it's more expensive than it needs to be. Natural gas is really cheap it's unusual. It's a heat pump based heating cooling system. It's unusual to do that in Alberta. So it was kind of the energy prices were working against us. But that coupled with, there's been anecdotal comments from staff saying, the air quality is much better. We don't have any data per se, and I haven't checked in with the owner about, well, have you seen a decrease in sick days, or also customers have commented on the indoor environment, right? So I'm sure there's business benefits. How do you quantify that's a challenge, but I think it's more than just the energy savings that have accrued to the owner.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to get that little bit of anecdotal evidence. And obviously there's a lot of difficulty getting those co-benefits kind of quantified. This was excellent. I think you did a great job of explaining, these case studies. It may be one project but it shows that it's possible. And so you can lay the foundation for others to follow. What is the role of Passive House overall in the building industry, kind of more broadly? Is it the standard that every building should be built to? Should it be built into code? What are your thoughts around that?
I mean, definitely initially it's showing people what's possible. So going back to earlier in the podcast about, hey, this is a new type of project beacon. Other car dealer owners might get inspired by it, or others might say, oh, my car dealership can do this. Okay, well maybe we can do this in this like industrial building or. So there's that. I mean, if I had my way, like everyone would be doing Passive House, right? Whether that's realistic or not, both from an industry perspective, from a compliance or code building code perspective, I guess maybe it's open to be seen, but I think it can, set the standard that we can aspire to and move as closely as we can to the standard.
Excellent. Taking us full circle, are you, now that you've gotten the buildings as efficient as you can get them through the Passive House standard, are you also doing some renewable consulting to offset and get to that net zero? Or how are you seeing that portion of the industry?
It tends to be a kind of add-on, a kind of nice to have if it's within the scope of the project budget or whatever else. Actually, this project I mentioned where we're trying to do that cost comparison of fundamental design changes, it's actually a condo project here in Ontario, 64 units, very progressive, forward-thinking developer. And there's an opportunity to integrate building integrated photovoltaics. And the company I've been talking to, they have an interesting business model of shifting the cost from capital cost to ongoing cost and kind of a shared revenue model. And that's could be an attractive thing for a developer who doesn't want to have extra additional capital costs. It raises the sale price. So if that can be shifted to operational, that could allow open the doors for integration of PV electricity. And we haven't yet explored how much could we generate from that, right? I know in these taller buildings it can be challenging. So that's to be seen, but they think there's opportunity there. And then another side of things is embodied carbon, right? This is actually a mass timber project, so the structure is mass timber. And then also looking at refrigerant mitigation, right? Another key piece now, growing in awareness. How do you mitigate heating, cooling system refrigerant use in buildings? So we're trying to manage that as well. So it could be a lot of interesting factors. And the neat thing about this project is the developer is building 3 of the same building. So we're doing a lot of the figuring out on the first building, and then we'll be able to replicate it and apply the lessons learned to the subsequent projects or buildings.
Excellent. That's awesome. I love to see that. And so sometimes the lessons get learned more slowly than I always hope. But I think that's an excellent thing. And one thing that we're seeing too is, when it's their second or third Passive House or, high performance project, that the project team is able to handle different challenges or to come up with ideas up front or see those envelope designs up front, that sort of thing. So that's excellent. So you mentioned embodied carbon, and I know one of the specifications, obviously, of Passive House is high performance insulation, and I'm sure you had to use a lot of insulation on the Subaru project, the car dealership, to make up for some of that car exhaust that you mentioned. Can you talk a little bit about anything that you've done or that you're thinking around embodied carbon and the use of, insulation materials? And is there an extent to which, a building, there's diminishing returns on installing additional insulation, or you haven't seen that yet?
No, and we tend to work on unique projects, not fully, but we don't go through 100 of the same building, right, to really refine things and really look in detail at some of these things. So we haven't come to any conclusions about that. We really drive home simplicity of HVAC, and we, particularly in the Canadian climate, we don't have quite the same cooling load, so we are trying to push the envelope on simplified heating cooling systems that can help reduce the capital cost of the HVAC system. And sometimes to achieve that, you're like, okay, well, if we can, we might have to add a bit more insulation, right, to drive those loads down to make it work, right? So it's a bit of a fine tuning, really balancing act. So sometimes you think at like the annual energy savings for the extra insulation, you're like, well, is that really payback? No, but if you look holistically, okay, that can make sense. Now, applying the embodied carbon perspective, we've not delved into that. We'd love to. I don't know if we have scope on this project to analyze the embodied carbon. It's certainly something we're keeping in mind. We generally try to avoid like spray foam where possible. But there's realities of non-combustible construction, which sometimes limit your insulation options, right? I think it's an ongoing challenge for the industry, and maybe a challenge to the manufacturers to reformulate or re-envision their products.
Yeah, and start to quantify and provide the information to, it's hard to determine where that product has come from when we don't have all the information from the manufacturer. So I know you've talked about, I think, a little bit the complementary, or maybe this was someone else. I don't want to attribute to you, but there's like a complementary nature of LEED and Passive House at times. Like, there's the energy efficiency kind of honing in on that, and then making sure that you maintain the indoor air quality and the comfort kind of in the Passive House realm. But LEED might cover all those other sort of things around embodied carbon and, making sure manufacturers are doing those sorts of disclosures so that we can look at another lens, like you said.
Yeah, I agree. I didn't speak to that in this podcast, but certainly that complementary nature of finding the alignment and working together to, deal with, address as many of the issues that constructing buildings leads to, right, or could lead to, right? So yeah, definitely there's a good marriage there that can happen. And
when we have you back on the podcast in 5 years, what will we be talking about then?
Oh, I don't know, Passive House Airport or space station. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully some of that additional data from some of the projects that you've been working on, for sure.
Definitely, yeah. I think actually a hospital, if we can bring this, they're working on a Passive House hospital in Germany. I think they were supposed to have been done. I don't know. We'll see where that goes. I'm going to be monitoring it. If we can take what they've done there and start to apply it here. I mean, obviously with our current situation, air quality and distribution and stuff's a critical one, and all the more so in a place like a hospital.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an excellent point. Around all that, the legislation that's going on around reducing carbon in buildings and kind of low carbon futures, I think there's a lot of discussion around what needs a carve out, what kind of building needs sort of a carve out for that this law or this rule doesn't apply to me. And I think those sorts of projects that you're saying, these like champion projects, a car dealership can do it, so can you kind of thing. I think having a hospital in the US, that would be excellent.
Yeah.
Well, we look forward to hearing about your hospital project in 5 years.
Whether it's us or somebody else, as long as it gets done. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. It was excellent to speak with you.
Well, thanks again for having me.
Thank you for listening to Buildings and Beyond. To learn more about the Subaru car dealership or Passive House in general, check out our show notes at swinter.com/podcasts. Buildings and Beyond is brought to you by Stephen Winter Associates. We believe our world is not as sustainable, healthy, safe, equitable, or inclusive as it needs to be, and we continually strive to develop and implement innovative solutions to improve the built environment. If you want to join us in our mission, visit swinter.com/careers. A big shout out to our production team, Dylan Martello, Alex Mirabile, Heather Breslin, and of course my co-host, Rob Aldridge. We thank you for listening, and we will see you next time.